The arrows came first. A black wall of Persian arrows blotting out the sun. Raining on the Spartans. Punching through shields. Through flesh. Through bone. The Spartans did not move. They stood in their phalanx, shields locked, spears upright. Persian cavalry swept across the field in waves, loosing arrows at point-blank range. Men were dropping. Blood soaked the ground beneath iron sandals. The line held. And still, the order to charge did not come. Pausanias. The Spartan commander stood behind the lines, head bowed over the altar, watching the entrails of the sacrifice. The omens were wrong. He slaughtered another animal. Studied the liver, the signs in the smoke. Wrong again. The goddess had not spoken. And until she did, no Spartan would advance. This was the Spartan code. You do not charge until the gods permit it. But the gods were silent. A shield bearer to Pausanias' left took an arrow through the throat and went down choking, hands at his neck. The Persian horsemen circled closer now, reading the stillness, mistaking discipline for fear. They were wrong about that. Charge, the soldiers begged. Just give the order. Let us fight. Pausanias raised his eyes to the sky. His jaw was iron. His hands were steady. But around him, 10,000 of his warriors were absorbing punishment they were trained to deliver, and waiting. One more sacrifice. One more prayer. Stay with us until the end of this video, because what happens on this plain will shock you. Not just the brutality of what's coming, but what happened to the men standing at that altar after the battle was won. The victory. The betrayal. The ending that history buried for 2,000 years. But to understand any of it, you need to understand how the Greeks even got here. How a civilization on the edge of extinction managed to put 45,000 men on this field. And what it cost them before a single sword was drawn. To understand why every second of hesitation matters, you have to go back. Back to the smoke. In 480 BC, following the legendary stand at Thermopylae, King Xerxes and the Persian army marched on and abandoned Athens. They systematically looted and burned the city, destroying temples and homes on the Acropolis. Later that same year, the allied Greek navy dealt a crushing blow to the Persian fleet at the Battle of Salamis. For one brief moment, it felt like the nightmare was over. They were wrong. Xerxes retreated to Persia, leaving behind his fiery general Mardonius and a carefully selected occupation force to winter in Thessaly. In the spring of 479 BC, Mardonius marched back into Attica and finished what his king had started. The Athenians, who had returned to attempt to rebuild their homes, were forced to evacuate once again as Mardonius razed the city completely. The message was psychological. This is what happens to those who resist. But the burning of Athens a second time did not break Greek resolve. It hardened it. And the response was unlike anything the ancient world had seen. According to the historical accounts of Herodotus, Sparta alone mobilized a total force of 45,000 men for the campaign. This included 5,000 elite Spartiate citizens, 5,000 Perioeci, and 35,000 helots. The Athenians, Corinthians, and Tegeans, every allied city-state that still had men to give, added their forces to the column. Together, the full Greek alliance that would take the field at Plataea numbered 110,000 men. But here is the detail that history tends to bury. Of those 45,000 Spartan men, 35,000 were helots, Spartan slaves. Men who worked Spartan land under conditions so brutal that Sparta declared a ritual war against them every year, just to legally keep them in check and violently suppress potential uprisings. In an act of desperation, the Spartans armed the helots and promised to free them if they fought bravely. And so they marched. Slave and citizen, shoulder to shoulder. The largest land force Greece had ever assembled, moving in formation toward a battlefield that would decide everything. Waiting for them on the other side of that plain was an army they had spent months telling themselves was a mindless, barbarian horde. They were wrong. Because the Persian army that waited across that plain were not mindless slaves whipped forward by a king's ambition. They were professionals. Mardonius had handpicked this force. He stripped away the conscripts, the reluctant tributaries. What remained were the Persian immortals. Lean, battle-hardened, and lethal. These men had campaigned from Egypt to India. They had broken armies that Greece could not have dreamed of facing alone. And leading the cavalry, the men who had been bleeding the Greeks for days, was Masistius. If there was ever a man built to look like a conqueror, it was him. The sources describe him as physically enormous, admired even by his enemies. His armor was a statement, a cuirass of golden scales that caught the sun like a second skin. 4 days, neither side moved. The Greeks held the high ground. The Persians controlled the plain. Oracles and omens said the same thing to both commanders: do not attack first. So they stared at each other across the dust, until Masistius got impatient. He led the cavalry charge himself, hammered into the Greek lines. And for a moment, it worked. The lines buckled. Men scattered. Then, during one of his charges along the Greek line, his horse took an arrow and threw him. Masistius hit the ground in full armor, disoriented. The Greeks swarmed him instantly. But the golden armor held. Swords glanced off. Spear thrusts deflected. For a moment it looked like the armor would save him, like he would walk out of this. Then one Greek soldier found the angle. He thrust his spear through the eye slit of Masistius' helmet. That was final. The Persians saw him fall. And what followed was wave after wave of cavalry charges toward the Greek line to recover his body. They fought with a grief-fueled intensity. They failed. The body of Masistius was paraded through the Greek lines. Soldiers crowded around it, touched it. The tension broke, briefly, into something that felt almost like celebration. But a dead cavalry commander does not end a war. It sharpens the hunger for vengeance. And Mardonius had not yet begun to fight dirty. In movies they show you the charge, the clash, the blood and the glory. But what they don't show you is the waiting. The slow, grinding, invisible killing that happens before a single sword is drawn. At Plataea, the real weapon wasn't Persian steel. It was thirst. The Greek alliance had made camp near the Gargaphia spring, the only fresh water source for the entire army. 110,000 men. One spring. The sun hammered the plain like a furnace lid. And Mardonius used it. The Persian cavalry moved in the dark and choked the spring with debris. They intercepted a food supply convoy coming in from the south. Pack animals were butchered in their traces. Grain wagons burned on the horizon. The passes back to the Peloponnese were sealed. Days passed. No battle. No charge. Just heat and silence and the slow collapse of men who hadn't drunk clean water in days. Dehydration cramped their muscles. Starvation dulled their reflexes. Every hour the Persians sat still, the Greek army bled a little more strength into the dirt. The alliance began to crack. Athenian officers demanded action. Corinthian captains whispered of retreat. The most powerful land army ever assembled on European soil was being dismantled, not by swords, but by the sun and one man's patience. Mardonius didn't need to attack. He just needed to wait. The Greek commanders knew it. The council met. They had one option left. Pull back under cover of darkness. Reposition to a new defensive line closer to Plataea, find water, re-establish supply lines. A clean, controlled night retreat. That was the plan. But what actually happened was a disaster. The Greek center, the contingents from Corinth and the other allied city-states, didn't wait for the signal. Whether it was panic or simple exhaustion-fueled cowardice, they broke formation and fled toward the walls of Plataea itself. Running from the fight. The Athenians on one flank. The Spartans on the other. Separated. Out of communication. Each waiting for the other to move first. And then there was Amampharidas. The Spartan regimental commander had not been present when the retreat was ordered. When he found out, he refused. He picks up a boulder, a rock so large it takes both hands to lift, and he hurls it at Pausanias' feet. That was his vote. That was all he had to say about retreat. Pausanias argued with him. Time was bleeding away. The darkness that was supposed to protect them was thinning toward dawn. Pausanias eventually marched the rest of the Spartan and allied forces away, expecting Amampharidas and his men to follow. For a moment, they didn't. Amampharidas held his ground, until he realized the main army had actually left him. Then he relented, and ordered his men to march. But the damage was done. Dawn was breaking. The Spartan division was strung out across open ground, mid-movement, caught between positions. The Athenians were out of sight on the other side of the field. And across the plain, Persian scouts were already riding back to Mardonius with the news. The Greeks were running. Mardonius smiled and ordered the full advance. Do you still remember Pausanias standing over an altar while his men bled into the dirt around him? Persian arrows falling like rain. The plain of Plataea soaked in Spartan blood while 10,000 warriors stood still, waiting for the order to charge. Now you understand the full weight of that moment. These men hadn't slept, hadn't eaten, hadn't had clean water in days. They were mid-retreat, strung out across open ground, caught in the worst position an army can occupy, moving, disorganized, exposed. And the entire Persian cavalry was now bearing down on them at full gallop. Mardonius had read the retreat perfectly. This was his moment. But Pausanias still would not charge without the omens. He understood something that went beyond tactics. His men needed to believe the gods were with them. So he sacrificed again. And again. Waiting for the omen while his men bled around him. The Tegean allies fighting beside them couldn't take it anymore. They began to advance on their own. Pausanias watched them go. Then he raised his hand. The omens had spoken. What happened next was not a charge in the way you're imagining it. The Spartans advanced. Not as men. As a wall with feet. Shields locked. Spears leveled. Stepping over their own dead with calm, mechanical precision. The ground shook under 10,000 pairs of iron-shod feet moving in perfect unison. The Persians poured arrows into them. The shields blocked the arrows. The Persian immortals fought with extraordinary courage. They grabbed Spartan spears with their bare hands trying to snap them. They wrenched the tops of Spartan shields downward, trying to break the line, fighting with daggers, with fists, with pure desperate will. But the Spartan phalanx had no weak point that courage alone could crack. For every Persian who grabbed a spear, there was another spear behind it. For every man who pulled a shield down, the wall simply closed again. Mardonius watched it happen from horseback. Refusing to accept what his eyes were telling him, he charged forward personally. Rallying. Screaming. Holding the line together through sheer force of personality. He rode with one goal: kill Pausanias, break the spell, turn this back into a fight instead of a slaughter. He almost made it. Then a Spartan soldier, named Eumnestus, picked up a stone from the ground and threw it. It crushed Mardonius's skull. And just like that, the Persian general was gone. The effect was instantaneous. Persian morale shattered. The elite cavalry broke first. The infantry followed. What had been a battle became a rout. The Persians fled toward their fortified camp, a massive stockade of wooden shields they had constructed north of the Asopus River. It was their fallback. Their sanctuary. Behind those walls they could regroup, reorganize, and wait for relief. But they never got the chance. The Spartans arrived first. They hit the walls, and for a moment, the fortification held. The Persians fought from the top of the stockade with everything they had left. Arrows. Spears. Rocks. Then the Athenians arrived. They breached the wall and poured through. What happened inside that stockade is one of the most brutal passages in all of ancient military history. The Persians were trapped. Disorganized. Nowhere to run. The Greeks carried out a ruthless, one-sided massacre. The numbers tell the story with brutal clarity. Of the force Mardonius led into Greece, Herodotus put it at 300,000. Historians estimate fewer than 3,000 made it back alive. That is not a defeat. That is annihilation. Over 95% of the most powerful invasion force the ancient world had ever seen, swallowed by a single afternoon on a plain in central Greece. Persia's ambitions in Greece died in that stockade. The empire that had burned Athens twice and marched further into Europe than any force before it was finished. If you enjoyed this journey into history, support the channel by liking this video, subscribing, and turning on notifications so you don't miss future stories of forgotten battles, legendary warriors, and the moments that shaped our world. Let me know in the comments what battle you want covered next.